Here you can see all of my playlists are listed along with the URIs, and these are my private playlists. I guess I'm not sure if these should be blurred out or not, but what's up everyone and welcome to this video. Firstly, I just want to say a massive thank you to a whopping 8,000 subscribers. It honestly means a lot when you guys are liking, subscribing, as well as telling me in the comments that you're finding my videos helpful. I know I'm not the most consistent YouTuber, but hopefully over time as this channel grows, I can invest more time and effort back into it. And hopefully these videos in the long run will help you in your programming journey. In this video, we're going to build an application that uses the Spotipy library. This library allows you to interact with the Spotify API to get everything from artists and albums to songs to anything you need to build your application. The really cool thing about this library is it does a lot of the heavy lifting, so you don't have to write too much code. And of course it provides a ton of methods that make it easy for you to get the data that you need. I made a video on how you can interact with the Spotify API and build authentication and do everything from scratch. It was a very detailed video, and I also explained OAuth and how it's used in authentication. Many people love that video because I explained line by line exactly what you were doing. I highly recommend checking that out maybe after this video, but if you just want to focus on interacting with the Spotify API in an easy way, then this video is for you. In this video, what I'm going to show you is how you can set up your own Flask web server that allows you to interact with the Spotify API using this Spotipy library. There's a few caveats with this library, so make sure you stick around for this video, and of course we're going to walk through every single line of code. With that said, let's get started. Alright, so the first thing that I want to do is go over the Spotipy API documentation. One thing that I like to encourage, especially when it comes to learning programming, is you really want to build up that skill of navigating API documentation. Being able to navigate API documentation is definitely an underrated skill, and that's the reason why I make a point in my videos to go through the documentation with you so that hopefully we can understand it together, and of course you can take it away for your future self when it comes to looking at documentation for other APIs. So we're going to start off by typing Spotipy API documentation, and that's going to take me to this first link here, welcome to Spotipy, and this takes me to the latest version, or the documentation for the latest version, I believe. I can click master here just to confirm, and it is 2.2, I believe it's 2.22.1. Alright, so here we have the Spotipy API documentation. The first thing you can see is a welcome message along with Spotipy is a lightweight Python library for the Spotify web API. But here you also see that they've given you code examples right away, and really this is trying to demonstrate that this is how you can get up and running quickly with interacting with the Spotify web API using Spotipy. In this example, it's showing you how you can get 30-second samples and cover art for the top 10 tracks for Led Zeppelin. And as you can see, it's probably 10 lines of code. And for those who are keen-eyed and have watched my previous video, you can probably notice here that they have some code for being able to use the OAuth authentication mechanism, and essentially here is where they take care of a lot of it for you. Now if you scroll down, you can see the features section. Here they're telling you about how you can access all the endpoints, the data that you can get from the Spotify web API, and they're encouraging you to actually visit the official documentation so that you can get a much better understanding of exactly what data you can access. They show you how you can install the library, which is what we're going to do later on. And then they have this getting started section, which dives into the crux of authorization. This is definitely the area that catches out most people if you're implementing auth from scratch with the Spotify API. But here they try and make it quite simple by breaking it down into two flows. Now these are the two most common flows, and on the official documentation, they talk about the differences between these two. So let's take a look at that. So if I open up a tab and go to the Spotify API documentation and then go to the web API, if I go into concepts and click on authorization and scroll down, you can see the different authorization flows. Here we can see authorization code with PKCE, client credentials, and implicit grant. The two that were shown on the Spotipy library documentation were authorization code and client credentials. Now if you're building an application where a user will be able to log in with their Spotify so you can access their data, you can't use client credentials. Client credentials does not let you access those user resources. Additionally, if you use client credentials, that token that you receive will only last for a certain period of time. And if you want to use client credentials again, unfortunately you can't programmatically refresh that token. Now going on that example of building an application where someone is going to log in with their Spotify, you want to use authorization code. That allows you to access user resources, that allows you to refresh the token, and Spotipy does all of this for you. This is the magic of the library, and it takes away a lot of this headache so you don't have to build it from scratch. So let's go back to the Spotipy documentation. Now here they mention that the authorization code flow is suitable for long-running applications where the user logs in once. It provides an access token that can be refreshed, and they refresh it for you. And if we scroll down, you can see how you can set up the authorization code flow, and they give you an example. The last thing I want to quickly show, and then we can actually go ahead and write some code, is scopes. Now you can see what they're doing is they're redirecting you to the official documentation. So if I click on this link, that takes me to the official documentation talking about scopes and what they are. Very quickly, scopes essentially define what your application has access to and what it does not have access to. This is relevant if you're building an application and needs access to specific types of data from the Spotify API. If a user is logging into your application with their Spotify account, they're going to be shown a list of all the different permissions that your application is going to have access to, in other words, scopes. So what you will need to do in your application is specify the scopes that you need. So A, you'll have access to that data, but B, the user is also giving you permission. They'll be able to see exactly what they're giving you access to. For example, if you want to access what the user is currently playing, you're going to need this streaming scope in the playback section. If you want to access their playlist, you're going to need one or two of these scopes, and the list goes on. In our example, I'm going to walk you through how you can use one of these scopes, but of course, when you're building your own application, it's worth taking a look at this page here so you can see exactly what scope set you're going to need. Now, there's just a few more things that I want to show you in the Spotipy documentation. This section here about customized token caching essentially is talking about exactly how Spotipy are storing the tokens that they're going to use to interact with the Spotify web API. Now they have different ways that they store the token depending on which handler you use. By default, they use the cache file handler, which will essentially store the token in a local file. The issue is we don't want to do that. We actually want to use a handler that isn't storing the token in a local file. Instead, what we want to do is use the Flask session cache handler, which will store the token in the current session. Now don't worry about understanding this for now. I'll go into more detail about this later on in the video, but essentially I just want you to understand that you have different ways for how the token is stored, and Spotipy give you more control over that here. And then the last thing I want to show you is just the API reference, and here for example they go through all the different methods that are available to you with the library. For example, if you want to get album tracks, it tells you exactly what parameters that you need to pass in, what values are expected for these, and what they will return. Now this is a very long list. There are many methods here. In our example, we're going to pick one of these, but of course when you're building your own application, I highly encourage that you look at this list and see what's available to you from this Spotify web API. Right, so let's get coding. So the first thing that I've done is I've created a folder for this project. I've called it Spotipy Get Playlists. You can of course call it something different, but essentially what you want to do is create that folder and then create a file in that folder. I've created a file called main.py, and open up your favorite editor. In this case, I'm using VSCode, and open up that folder in that editor. Once you've done that, there's a few boilerplate things that I want us to do so that we can get our environment set up so that we're ready to start using the library. We're going to need Python 3 for this project, and you can verify that you've got Python 3 installed by typing Python 3 and tapping enter, and that brings you into the Python shell. I've got Python 3.11, you might have Python 3.6, 3.7, that should be fine, but just make sure it's Python 3. Now I'm not sure I've gone over virtual environments in any of my previous videos, but let me explain it to you now. A virtual environment in Python essentially allows you to have an isolated environment where you can install dependencies. You can install versions of those dependencies in this isolated environment so that you can use that environment for your project. This is really important because over time, as you build multiple projects, each project will have its own requirements for different dependencies and versions. And the advantage of these isolated environments is that you won't run into conflicts or issues because that environment is isolated to that project. Alright, so to create the virtual environment, type Python 3 followed by the -m flag. This -m flag is saying that anything that comes after this flag, we want to use this version of Python to run that command. So in this case it's Python 3, and then the command that we want to run is called venv, Venv is shorthand. You see, it's a mouthful, right? Venv is shorthand for virtual env, virtual environment, right? And venv is the command in Python that allows us to create a virtual environment. And then the last thing that we need to do is give it the name of the environment that we want to create. I typically call it venv. It looks counterintuitive, but essentially I call any environment that I make venv, because what will happen is it's going to create a folder called venv inside this directory, and I'll show you that in a second. And in that way, because this folder is inside the directory, it's isolated to this project. So if I tap enter, you will see that it goes ahead and it creates the virtual environment, and I can confirm by typing ls-a, and here you can see of course we have a main.py file, but more importantly you have a folder for our virtual environment here. For the more curious, you can of course cd into this directory and you will see the bin folder, and then if we go in there you can see the Python version that is being used for this virtual environment, and of course the packages will be installed in the .lib folder, which for now I believe is empty. And we can, inside packages, we have a few there, pip, setup tools of course, and dist utils, but we're going to add onto this. Okay, so it's time to install the dependencies that we're going to need for this project. So what I'm going to do is create a file that we're going to use to store the dependencies along with the versions of those dependencies that we're going to need for this project. So I'm going to create a file, and you can do that using the touch command, and I'm going to call that requirements.txt, and you can see on the left hand side it creates a requirements file. And for this project we just need two dependencies. The first one is going to be Flask, and for this we're going to specify the version as being 3.0.2. The second library or dependency that we're going to use is the Spotipy library, and here the version I did have a look and it was 2.23.0. So these are the two requirements dependencies that we're going to use for the project. We put them in here. On the left hand side you've got the name, equals signifies that we want the version or the version specified afterwards to be 3.0.2 for that dependency. And now that's saved in here, I can come back in the terminal and now I can install these dependencies into the virtual environment. Okay, so to activate our virtual environment, all you need to do is type in source, followed by the name of our virtual environment. And what I'm going to do is trigger my autocomplete here because we need to add a few more bits. So we need to add bin/activate. So source, the name of the virtual environment, /bin/activate. This activate is a script that's going to, when we run the source command, be triggered or run. And what it will do is it will activate the virtual environment. So if I tap enter, you can see, if you're running this in the terminal, you can see something's changed here. On the left hand side, what will happen now and going forward until we deactivate, you will see the name of the virtual environment in brackets. This is very handy because when you're working virtual environments, sometimes you don't know which environment you're currently or is currently activated, and sometimes you want to just verify that you've deactivated a virtual environment once you've finished with it. So this is quite handy, and of course this is available if you're using VSCode or you're running these commands from a terminal. So now we know that the virtual environment is activated. All we need to do to install the dependencies defined in this requirements.txt file is run pip install. Pip, of course, is our dependency manager in Python, so all you need to do is type in pip install the -r flag, which is to say that we're going to give it a text file that contains the dependencies and the versions of those dependencies we want to install, and that is requirements.txt. I tap enter, and as you can see, it installs all of those dependencies, and it just gives me a warning saying that there's a newer version of pip available, which I'm not going to install now. Cool, so now that we've got our environment set up along with the dependencies installed, it's now time to write some code that's going to work with the Spotipy library. Okay, so I'm in my main.py file, and the first thing that we want to do is import the Flask library, and you can do that by typing in from Flask import Flask. Just a reminder, Flask is a lightweight web framework library in Python that allows you to quickly spin up and create web applications. What I really like about this library is it's very lightweight. With only a few lines of code, you can quickly spin up your own web application. And I've personally worked with very large projects that have scaled this Flask micro framework into a fully fledged production app. Once you've imported the Flask library, there's one more library that I want to import, and that is OS. We're going to use that in a second. And then to create the Flask app, all we need to do is type in app is equal to Flask, followed by the name directive. And essentially this creates a Flask app and it stores it in this app variable. And the last thing we want to do is be able to run this Flask app when we run the file. So to do that, all I need to do is type in if name __ is equal to __ main. And this is just telling Python when we run this application, this is the first line of code, or we want to run everything in this block. And in this case, all we need to do is type in app.run. App is of course the variable which is storing our Flask application, and then I type in app.run, and then I'll set debug equal to true. And this flag here, when you pass it in this run function, what it enables is that as we make changes in our code, when we save those changes, it will restart the server, so we don't have to do that manually. Okay, and we can quickly test that this is working by typing in Python 3 main.py, which runs our Flask web application. Here you can see it's serving our Flask app named main. Debug mode is on, and we have a warning that's saying this is a development server, just don't use it in production. And here we can see that our application is running at this address on that port. So if I copy that, switch over, and I paste it here, it says that the requested URL was not found on the server. It's because we have nothing specified or no page specified as of yet. So of course we're going to set that up. Okay, so the next thing that we need to do is set up our Flask session. Let me explain to you what a session is in the context of web applications. Think of a session like a container that allows us to store data inside. And the idea behind this is to allow us to be able to access this data as the user is moving from page to page in our web application. We want to be able to access that data no matter what page the user is visiting, and the session allows us to have a place to store that data. In the context of this Spotipy library, it needs a place where it can store the access token that it will use to interact with the Spotify web API. And we're going to specify that where it can store that access token is inside the Flask session that we're going to create. So let's start by importing the session. So if I go here where we are importing Flask, I can import the session. And this refers to the global session. A session is just a place for our web server, in this case Flask, to be able to access the data inside. And we don't want users tampering with the data inside that session. And to do that, we need to give Flask a secret key that it can use to encrypt that data. Now to specify that secret key, all you need to do is type in app.config, and then in square brackets type secret key. And then you can set that to some arbitrary string. But in this case, what I'm going to do is generate that on the fly. So I can do that by typing in OSU random, and we'll make this 64 bytes long. Now in a production environment, ideally you want this to be a fixed string that is stored either in an environment variable or in a secure credentials store. But in this case, I'm just generating it on the fly. What I'm doing here is generating a string of 64 random bytes, and of course I'm assigning it to the secret key configuration variable. Okay, now that we've got that set up, let's add a few more variables that we're going to use for this application. These variables are needed by Spotify and the Spotify web API, and there's a few of them. So the first one is client ID, the second one is client secret, the third one is redirect URI, and the fourth is scope. I mentioned scope earlier. When it comes to accessing specific data from the Spotify web API, you're going to need certain permissions, and scope is going to be the place or the variable that we're going to define what permissions or what scopes we want to be able to access. So to get values for the client ID and the client secret, we're going to need to create an application on the official Spotify web API website. Anytime you want to interact with the Spotify web API, you need to tell Spotify about it. And that involves creating an account and creating an application for each one that you're going to build that's going to interact with the Spotify web API. So let me show you how you can do that. Okay, so in your web browser, navigate to developer.spotify.com and make sure you're logged into Spotify. In this case, I'm logged in. And if I click the drop down here, I can click on this dashboard link and click the create app button. And then in the app name, give a name for your application. In this case, I'm going to call it Spotify example. This is a web application that will use the Spotipy library to interact with the Spotify web API. We don't need to specify a website, but for the redirect URI, we do want to specify the following. So type in HTTP localhost, and as you can see, I've got it here in the autocomplete. But what you want to do is enter the following: localhost 5000/callback. I'll talk more about this later on, but for now, just enter that. And then the last thing that you want to do is specify which API/SDKs this application will be accessing. In our case, we're just going to be accessing the web API. And then the last thing that you need to do is click on this checkbox and then click on save. And once the application is created, what you want to do in the top right, you want to click settings, and then that allows you to see some basic information about your application. But what we're after is the client ID, which you can see here. So copy that. And if we click on the view client secret, that reveals the client secret. And again, make sure you copy that too, and then take those and paste them back in your code file. Right, so I've pasted the client ID and the client secret here, but ideally what you want to do is store these either in environment variables or in a secure credential store. Again, because this is just an example, we're not going to do that. I'm going to keep this as simple as possible to make it easy for you. And of course, this application isn't going to be deployed to production. The next thing you want to do is specify the value for the redirect URI. And if you remember, I specified this to be http://localhost 5000/callback when we created the application on the Spotify web API dashboard. Again, I will come back to this, but for now, just set it to this. The last thing that we're going to do is specify the scopes that our application is going to access from the Spotify web API. And because all this application is going to do is print out a user's playlist, we just want to specify the scope that's going to allow us to do that. And to do that, all we want to do is set that equal to playlist/read/private, which is the scope that allows us to get back a user's private playlists. By the way, as you're building your web application, you might need more than one scope, and to specify that, all you need to do is separate them with commas. So you type a comma and you specify the next scope. If I remember correctly, another one was called streaming. So, for every scope, just make sure you separate it with a comma. In this part, what we want to do is tell the Spotipy library what kind of authentication we want to use. In this case, we want to use the authorization code flow, which is OAuth, and also where Spotipy needs to store the access token. We mentioned that we want the access token to be stored in the Flask session, so I'm going to show you how we can configure all of that. So let's start off by importing the different Spotipy modules that we're going to use. So the first one is Spotify, as weird as that sounds. From Spotipy, import Spotify. And then I'm going to copy this because we're going to import a few more. From Spotify, we're also going to import the OAuth too. Import the Spotify OAuth module. OAuth. And then from Spotipy.cachehandler, I believe, we're going to import the Flask session cache handler. Okay, so I believe all of that is correct. And these are the modules that we're going to use to set up our authorization with the Spotipy library and thereby the Spotify web API. So let's start off by telling Spotipy that it can store the access token in our Flask session. So to do that, we need to set up the Flask session cache handler. So we can type in cache handler, set that equal to the Flask session cache handler, and here we need to pass the session. Now earlier on we imported, I thought we imported the session, but you can just type that here from Flask. As we're importing Flask, you can import the session too. And here we just pass in the session. The next thing we want to do is create what's known to Spotipy as an authentication manager. This is essentially how we're going to authenticate with the Spotify web API. And I mentioned that we're going to use the authorization code flow mechanism. So let's create our authentication manager. I'm going to call it sp_auth. And I'm going to set that equal to be an instance of Spotify OAuth. This authentication manager needs some parameter values that we're going to pass in, and it's going to use those to authenticate with the Spotify web API. The first one it's going to need is the client ID for our application. So I'm going to set that equal to the client ID, which we've already defined above. The next one is the client secret. Set that again to the client secret we've defined above. The redirect URI, again, we've defined many of these above and we're just passing them in. The scope, the cache handler, and we're going to set that equal to the cache handler that we've created. Again, we're going to store, or we're going to tell Spotify to store the access token in the Flask session, and this cache handler is going to do that for us. The last thing we want to do is set this flag called show dialog equal to true. And I'm doing this because I want to know that every time we log in with Spotify, I want it to show that page, which is login with Spotify. This I'm doing for debugging purposes. You don't have to set this to true, but I'm doing this because when I show you, or when we run the demo, I want you to be able to see the screen that the users are going to see when they're being requested to log in with Spotify. The last thing that we need to do is put all of this together and create an instance of the Spotify client, and that's going to allow us to then interact with the Spotify web API. So I'm going to call this client SP, and I'm going to set that equal to Spotify, an instance of Spotify. Again, we've imported this above, and then you need to pass in the auth manager, which we've created. Auth manager, and set it equal to SP OAuth. And that's it. That's all we need to do, and we're ready to now start writing our endpoints that are going to let the user log in with Spotify, as well as get access to our playlists and print them out. Okay, so let's start off by writing our first endpoint. Essentially, when someone accesses the root of our web application, we want to do one of two things. We want them to log in with their Spotify account, and as I mentioned, Spotify is going to show that user exactly what permissions they're giving our application and what data we're going to be able to access on the Spotify API. Now, if they visit their homepage but they've already logged in before, what we want to do is redirect them to an endpoint that's going to get all of their playlists and then print them out on the page. So let's set up this endpoint now. We can do this by typing app.root, and I'm going to define the homepage, which is just going to be the slash here. This is our Flask app. This is how you define the root for your web application in Flask, and this is the root. So when you go to the web browser and you visit our web application and you type slash, which is essentially the homepage, that's going to take you or execute the code in this endpoint. Then what we want to do is type def home. So this is going to be a function. And then here what we want to do is check if they've logged in already. So if they've not logged in, we want them to log in. So let's start off with that. So if not, SP_OAuth, which is our authentication manager, validate token. And then what we want to do is pass in our cache handler, and then we want to get the cached token. If they've not already logged in, then what we want to do is get them to log in. And then for that, we need to type in auth_URL and set that to SP_OAuth, get authorize_URL. And then we want to return a redirect to that auth URL. So let's go through this. The first thing is that our authentication manager that we created above, called SP_OAuth, actually has a few different methods that we can use. One of those methods is called validate token, and that allows us to check if we have a valid token. In other words, a token that can be used to interact with the Spotify web API, and one that hasn't expired. Now, I mentioned that Spotify will be storing the token in the Flask session, but if we want to retrieve that token, they also give us a method that exists on the cache handler for us to be able to get that cache token. Now, if the user is visiting the homepage but they haven't logged into our application yet, get cache token will return empty, in which case when we validate the token, given that it's empty, it will return false. In other words, we don't have a token that's valid. If we don't have a valid token, what we want to do is take them to the login with Spotify page. And again, there is a method available on the authentication manager, SP_OAuth, that we created above, which we can use to get the URL that will take them to login with Spotify. And that method is called getAuthorizeURL, and the last thing that we're doing is redirecting to that auth URL. Now this handles the case where they haven't already logged in, and what we want to do is take them to the login with Spotify page. If it turns out that they are logged in, all we want to do is redirect them to the endpoint that we haven't yet created, but this endpoint will get the user's playlists and print them out onto the screen. So here all we need to do is type in return redirect, and in the brackets we type in URL_4. Let's go and import that because that is a Flask module. URL4, import that above, and then we come back here, and then we need to pass in the endpoint, and in this case it's going to be get playlists. Like this, it's going to be a method, you know, in this case this one's called home, but when we create the endpoint we're going to call the method get playlists, and URL4 is essentially going to get the URL for that method, and then what we're doing is redirecting to that URL. Okay, the next endpoint that we're going to create is the callback endpoint. If you remember, early on we defined this redirect URI, and we set that equal to http localhost 5000/callback. Now this one's a bit trickier to explain if you aren't familiar with OAuth and how Spotify does OAuth in their authorization flow. If you are interested in a more detailed explanation of OAuth and Spotify OAuth, I will put a link to my other video where I go in depth into that. But for the purposes of this video, just know that this is the place where we're going to be refreshing the token. In other words, our authentication manager called SP OAuth that we created earlier, in this endpoint is going to perform some logic that's going to refresh the token when it expires. And Spotify needs to know that endpoint. And that's why we've defined it here in redirect URI. And we've also defined it, if you remember earlier, when we created our application on the Spotify web API dashboard. Now again, if you're implementing OAuth from scratch with the Spotify library, you would have to write much more code here. But here we're using the Spotify library and it takes care of all of it for you. All we need to do is call one method. So let's create this endpoint. So I'm going to call this callback. So app.root, and then in here I'm going to have /callback. And then what I'm going to do is define the method def callback. And then what we're going to do is call sp_auth. And then we're going to call this method called get access token. And this is going to get the code that comes back in the request arguments. And then it's going to redirect to the get playlists endpoint, which again we haven't defined yet, we will do in a second. So when the user visits the homepage and they log in with Spotify, Spotify come back to our application to this callback method, and they give us a code, and then the authentication manager will store this code, and then going forward it will use that code to get the access token and then refresh that access token. It does all of that for you behind the scenes. You don't have to do anything, and just know that because of this, a user won't have to continuously log in again and again with Spotify. The only time that the user will have to log in with Spotify again is if you change the scope. So if you add another scope, maybe you want an additional permission to access more data from a Spotify or a user Spotify account. In that case, they require that the user logs in with Spotify again and approves those permission requests. And then of course the last thing that we're doing here is that we're just redirecting to the get playlist endpoint. At this point they're authenticated and we just want to print out their playlists. Just before I forget, let's do some imports. I noticed that I missed one, so if you go back to the top of the file, we're going to need to, from Flask, import request, and then we're going to import redirect. We have session, we have URL4, and I think that's everything here for now. Okay, so now it's time to implement the somewhat beefy get playlist endpoint. So in this endpoint, what we want to do is use the Spotify library to get a user's playlists, and we want to print them out onto the screen. Okay, so let's create the root. We type app.root, and then we'll call it get_playlists. And then we're going to call def get playlists. That's the method. And then what we want to do is we want to take this code above here, and this is the code that's going to check if the token is valid, and if it's not, it's going to make them log in again. Ideally what we want to do is extract this into its own method, but for now we'll leave it as it is. I'll leave that to you as an exercise. But again, this is just validating that the token that is currently in the session is still valid and it hasn't expired. And if it isn't, then we just get them to log in again. Now we've reached a point here where the token is valid, and now it's time to get the playlist using the Spotify library. Okay, so to get the user's playlist, all we need to do is type in playlists equals to sp.current_user_playlists. And SP we defined above earlier on, and this is the Spotify client. And this is the client in which you're going to call methods on to get all the data that you need from the Spotify web API. So in this case, we're getting the playlists, but of course, the Spotify library has so many different methods for you to retrieve everything from albums and songs and much more. Now, current user playlist, I think, has some parameters, but I don't think you need to specify them. This will out of the box give you, even if it's a limited set of the user's playlists. And then what I'm going to do is just some Python magic to get details about those playlists and print them out onto the screen. So to do that, I'm going to type playlists_info, and then we'll set that equal to a list comprehension. And this list comprehension is going to be PL, which is shorthand for playlist, name. And then what I'll do is I'll get PL. What else should we get? We'll get the external URLs, and then we'll get Spotify URL, and then we'll do for PL in playlists or playlists, and then items, because each playlist or all the playlists are in the items key in this response. So that's going to get all the playlist info. And then what I'll do is let's set this up for display. So I'll do playlists HTML. This is going to be very bare bones, but it will do the job. We'll add a line break for each one of these, and then we'll join. And then what I'll do is another list comprehension, and then we'll set that equal to an F string, and then we'll just do the name followed by the URL, and then we'll set that equal to for name URL in playlists info. And I believe maybe what we need to do is, of course, give that a list. I think we're good to go. And then what I'll do is return playlist_display. Okay, so this is just a bit of Python where we've set up a list comprehension. And what we're doing is we're iterating through every playlist. In this case, I've shorthanded it to PL. In these playlists result that we got back in the items key. The items will have, or is essentially the list of all the users' playlists. And then what I want to do is extract out the name as well as the Spotify URL for that particular playlist. I'm storing that in playlist info, and then what I'm doing is creating a HTML response, which is going to, BR stands for line break. It's just going to print out the name of the playlist along with the URL on its own line. So line by line, we'll be able to see all the playlists, and then I'm just returning that back. Okay, the last endpoint that I want to create is the logout endpoint. Essentially what we want to do here is just clear the session. So I want to completely remove the access token and everything in the session so that a user is forced to log in again. Strictly speaking, it's not needed, but I want to add this to show you that logout works and show you that a user will need to log in again with their Spotify account to use our web application. So all we need to do, as we've been doing so far, is create an app root /logout. And in this case, we're going to call it logout. And then what we do is we call this method that's available on the session object that we imported earlier. You know, here where we from Flask we imported session. There is a handy method called session.clear. As simple as that. And that clears everything in the session. And then what we do is we just redirect back to the home endpoint. So we do redirect, if I can get it, redirect URL for home. And that will take us back to the home page. And that's where the user will be requested to log in again. Okay, I think we've got everything. Now it's time to give this application a run. So what I'm going to do is type Python, or just before I do that, I notice I've made a mistake here. Here we need to return playlist HTML. Okay, now let's give it a run. So type Python 3 main.py, and we're good. So here we can see the server is running. Let's navigate to this. Alright, so here's the exciting part, it's the demo, and what we're going to do is we now have the Flask web application running, and we know it's running on 127.0.0.1 on port 5000, and what happens is when I visit this URL, it's going to take me to the home endpoint, and if you remember, in the home endpoint, we had logic that's going to make the user, in this case me, log in with Spotify. So hopefully, if I visit this URL, it does that. Fantastic. So what I'm going to do is log in with Spotify. And then here we can see the confirmation box. Now, if you remember, I talked about scopes earlier and how scopes basically define the data that your application will be able to access on behalf of that logged in user. As you can see, playlist is listed here. Think of this as just a warning. Spotify is just letting the user know that this web application is going to be able to get access to this data. Are you okay with that? We are okay with that. Now, what will happen is when I click agree, hopefully, we're hoping that all of my playlists will be retrieved. So Spotify is going to retrieve all of my playlists and it's going to print out the name and the URIs because we define that in the get playlist endpoint. So here's the moment of truth. Let's click agree. Fantastic. Okay, that's quite large for me, probably not too large for you, but here you can see all of my playlists are listed along with the URIs. And these are my private playlists. I guess I'm not sure if these should be blurred out or not, but it's fine. Anyways, it works. So this is Spotify in action. We wanted it to get all of our playlists. It's authenticated with OAuth. It's done all the things and we can see that it works here. So that's great. Alright, so that's the end of the video. I really hope you enjoyed it and hopefully you learned how you can use the Spotify library to be able to interact with the Spotify web API. I still recommend that you check out my previous video where I go into much more depth on how you can interact with the Spotify web API from scratch. Other than that, if you haven't already, please do give this video a like so we can grow this channel, and subscribe if you want to see more videos like this. Until next time, see ya.